let's dive deeper into the authentication provider in Spring Security. To follow along, open the authentication provider interface from the Spring Security library. Authenticate. Make sure you choose authentication provider from Spring Security library. Now, the authentication interface is actually very much simple. It only contains two methods. First one is the authenticate method. Second one is the support method. So let's break it down. So the authenticate method is where all your authentication logic lives. So here what happens, the provider manager basically calls this particular authenticate method. It passes the authentication object, which contains your username, password, other details, and also the authenticated boolean as a false. Now, if you're building a custom authentication provider, you need to load the user detail from your data source, validate credentials like password matching, perform any additional checks, business logic, and also you need to return an updated authentication object with success or failure. Now, if you do check the default implementation of DAO authentication provider, just open the DAO authentication provider and let's just go to your authenticate method. Now it basically follows the exact same steps like extracting the username, load the user from your data source, retrieve user method, validate password using password authenticator, and basically returning your authentication object. So essentially you are replicating this flow with your own customization. The next method, which is your supports method. So this method tells Spring Security that what type of authentication does my provider support. For example, DAO authentication provider, which is this. Let me just open the supports method. Here you can see it is basically returning the user password authentication token.class is assignable from your authentication. So when provider manager basically receives your authentication object, it checks which provider support this type and then basically calls the appropriate one. Now we have different authentication types. So let me just go to the authentication provider and you can just click on here. Spring Security supports multiple authentication token. Some examples like testing authentication provider for your public users. Remember Me authentication provider, OIDC back channel, OIDC authentication requests. So OIDC is related to OAuth 2 authentication providers, JAS based authentication provider, DAO authentication provider, which we have previously seen, anonymous authentication provider, abstract JAS authentication provider. So if we take an example, if a user access a public API, then anonymous authentication provider is basically used. And if we are doing some unit testing, then we can also go with the testing authentication provider. Let me just go to the testing authentication provider. We have two methods, which basically it's authenticate and support, the same which we have seen. So this particular testing authentication provider is a special case. So there is a special implementation called testing authentication provider. So basically what this particular class does, it does not perform real authentication. It just simply returns the same object which basically it receives here. And this is very much useful for unit testing where you do not want your real authentication logic. And just to note here, we do not use this particular class in a production. This is a note here. Now, let's jump to how our provider manager works internally. So let's understand the real flow. Let me just go to the authentication manager. So here we have the authenticate method. Just for here, you just go to provider manager, and here inside provider manager, let me just go to our authenticate manager. This particular authenticate method accepts authentication object and returns a authentication object. It also takes it as a authentication object. Now, if you can see here, it basically loops through all of your available authentication provider. For each provider, it basically supports or support method. If basically your false is getting returned, then it basically skips it. If it returns the true, then the authenticator method gets called. So if authentication is basically succeed, it basically stop, otherwise continue to the next provider. So this means that multiple provider can support the same token, and provider manager will try them one by one, iterating all the providers. Now, the key takeaways of this particular session is the authentication provider has only two methods, which is authenticate manager, which is authenticate method, and another is the support method. Authenticate method basically handles your actual authentication logic, and supports method basically responsible for deciding the applicability of your provider. Also, provider manager acts like a dispatcher here, and the support method is critical for routing authentication correctly. So you can build fully custom authentication flow using this particular interface. So that's it for this lecture. In the next video, we will going to deep dive into the authentication customization. So see you there. Thank you. Bye bye.